I want to introduce myself real quick. My name is Krmpotic. I'm with the AEM product management team. I've done this for the last 4 to 5 years, specifically around integrations between AEM, Adobe Target, Adobe Analytics, and Adobe Campaign. So various types of different use cases, integrations. Just before we heard the integration between, I would say, Campaign and the various tools. So what we'll talk about today specifically is the integration between AEM and Adobe Target. And before I get started, maybe a quick show of hands. What kind of, let's say, roles are represented here today? So anyone on the business side, so who considers themselves to be non-technical or a marketer? Anyone here? Okay, a couple of people. Anyone an AEM developer? Like who's an AEM developer? And design, anyone? Tech or like design, one person. Marketing operations, maybe? And then from the roles that I mentioned, who did I miss? Like what roles did I not ask for? Like anyone?
Architect.
Architect, awesome. Anyone else? Okay, great. So I think we have a good mix here across the board. So I think one piece that I want to start with, and this is basically the result of, I think, running into a lot of issues and the result of multiple conversations with customers. I think when we talk to customers, and something that I didn't realize for myself, is when you look at a website, not every page is equally important. So let's say Adobe.com has a page that generates about 40 million in revenue every day, right? And then there are certain pages that don't generate as much revenue every day. And it's typically this type of bell curve where you have pages that belong to the so-called head, and there are pages that belong to the so-called tail, right? So what we realize is when we talk to customers, they always ask, like, how do we personalize pages? And the expectation is that there's one answer to that question. And there is no such one answer because not every page is the same, and given that not every page is the same, there are different best practices and different approaches that we've learned and that we are recommending. So for the last year or two, we've been trying to raise awareness around the fact that depending on what page you're working on and what page you're trying to personalize, there's maybe a slightly different approach. And there's an integration in AEM that allows you to expose Adobe Target functionality. There's an integration in Adobe Target that allows you to expose AEM functionality. And for that reason, a lot of customers then argue and oftentimes have internal conflict where they argue which one of these approaches is best. And the answer is it depends, right? So as usual in life, it depends on what part of the page you're working on. And just to make it clear that when I talk about the head and the tail, something I've realized is when I talk about the head and the tail, sometimes people assume that we're talking about the portion of the page, right? That's not the case. So a page that belongs to the head would be a landing page. Let's say if you go to apple.com, that homepage would be a page that belongs to the head, right? And then if you go to a documentation page that explains how to connect your iPhone to the next Wi-Fi hotspot, that would be a page that belongs to the tail, or like to the tail. And typically, the characteristics between pages that belong to the head and the tail is obvious. Oftentimes, pages that belong to the head change frequently. Pages that belong to the tail don't change as frequently, right? Because if they don't generate as much revenue, it probably doesn't make as much sense to update it as often. And a couple of examples here: blog posts, product documentation, press releases, and then at the top, some examples for the head. That said, today's core message is not every page is the same, and given that not every page is the same, there's a slightly different approach to personalizing pages that belong to the tail and the head. We did a similar presentation at Adobe Summit. It was one of the biggest presentations we've had at Summit, which makes me think that this use case, even though it sounds rather basic, is, I would say, causing a lot of problems and causing a lot of challenges to a lot of our customers. And every year at Summit, it's one of the biggest sessions, even though you could argue that the use case is not necessarily rocket science. But when you look at it a little closer, you realize that there are some challenges. And that one is, I would say, the first one to begin with. So what we'll look at today is how to choose the right process for your organization. And depending on whether it's the head or the tail, We'll talk about that you should use, if you're using Adobe products, both of these solutions, AEM and Adobe Target, right? Sometimes customers wonder if it's possible to only use one of the two. And then lastly, we'll talk about a little bit of the org structure. So I've also looked at what's the typical org structure that a lot of our customers use when they try to personalize experiences at scale. So let's look at pages that belong to the tail or the long tail. The idea here is that you and your team identify pages that belong to the tail and that may eventually become part of the head, right? So you kind of groom them and you optimize them to the point that they do generate substantial business results, that they hit certain KPIs. The problem is that the pool of pages that you're selecting from is quite large. So that's the challenge, is like how to identify those pages quite easily. For those in the audience that are not necessarily familiar with that separation of the head and the tail, if you don't necessarily have a strategy in place for the long tail, you're not alone. So this is actually a statistic that we have from Adobe's internal research program. So about only 30% of the Fortune 500 companies actually optimize and personalize the tail. So if you're not thinking about the tail, and if you're not really set up to optimize the tail, you're not alone. At the same time, I want to call out that optimizing the tail presents a major opportunity for you, because if most customers focus on the head pages, then the difference between you and your competitor ends up being very marginal, because oftentimes you employ and use the same tactics, and then eventually pages that belong to the head are oftentimes equally optimized. So the major opportunity that a lot of our customers have is to also optimize the tail, because that's like the way how they can actually add a little bit of a differentiator. The other major point when it comes to the tail is when it comes to personalizing content and pages that belong to the tail, you have to do the personalization during the content creation. I'll explain in a second what that means. The point is that given that those pages don't necessarily bring in that much revenue, that much traffic, or any other KPIs you're tracking, you can't necessarily afford to have multiple people working on that same page. So you can't necessarily have someone create the content. You can't really afford to have someone else think about how to personalize that page. You can't have someone like a third person then put it all together. So the point is that for pages that belong to the tail, all of this has to happen at the same time by the same person. So the page has to be written by the same person, the page has to be assembled by the same person, and then lastly, the page has to be optimized and A/B tested, and any other type of activity has to be done by the same person. Because if it's not done during the content creation, it will never get done, because the backlog of pages that need to be created for the long tail is so long that you will never ever be able to catch up with any of those pages that are not optimized yet. So the main takeaway here is for pages in the tail is to optimize and personalize those pages during the content creation. A couple of more thoughts here. What I've seen a lot of times prevent customers from optimizing content during the content creation is, number one, that content is not being created in the web content management system. So specifically in our case, a lot of our customers don't actually create editorial content in AEM. They create content in Word, in Google Docs, and in many other places, let's say Evernote. And the issue is, if the content is being created outside of AEM, you can imagine that it takes effort and processes to actually get that content into AEM. And you can already see there's like an extra step in between. And this extra step actually then prevents a lot of our customers from applying a lot of the personalization capabilities that are available in AEM. So number one, if you're having issues with optimizing your long tail, it's probably because you're not creating the content in AEM, so you should think about doing that. If you're using a content marketing platform to create content, such as Percolate, Skyward, Compost, or any of those pieces, make sure that at least there is an integration path between these platforms in AEM. A lot of these platforms that I just mentioned provide an integration with AEM, and especially they provide personalization capabilities in the content marketing platform. So try to leverage that as much as you can, but then make sure that that content actually ends up in AEM in that personalized fashion, the way it was defined in your content marketing platform. So just to make that point one more time clear, let's say Skyward or Percolate allow you to set up an A/B test in their platform, but if that A/B test doesn't make it into AEM, then it's as if you didn't actually set it up. So it's really critical to make sure that if you're creating that content in a content marketing platform, that it connects into AEM. And lastly, what we've seen is, and that's I think for 80% of our customers the case, content is being created in Microsoft Word. So what we've done actually for the last year, since we have this relationship now with Microsoft, is to figure out how we can connect Word with AEM so that as content is being created in Word, it can be pushed into AEM. So just as a heads up, that's something we're working on that will eventually come. But the point is that, going back to my main message, really make sure that content is being personalized as it's being created. And in today's world, at least what you can do for your writers and the content team that you have is to introduce at least some sort of templates, some sort of like a checklist that they have to go through before they submit content to AEM. Because that way you can at least account for the fact that personalization takes place before it hits AEM. Now that we talked about the tail, let's talk about the head, which I think a lot of our customers struggle a lot with, while the long tail represents a major opportunity because, like I said, everyone is definitely working on the head. The bread and butter of personalization is taking place in the head. So let's look at what kind of challenges customers have there, right? So pages, again, that drive a lot of traffic. Given that they drive a lot of traffic or revenue or any other KPI that you're tracking, it is okay to leverage a team of people. So just the way I said it for the tail, you can't afford to have multiple people engaged and working on a single page. In this case, it's okay and almost necessary to have multiple people because those are pages that are oftentimes already pretty optimized, right? So if something is already pretty optimized, to squeeze out this 0.5% of an increase or like a percent, you need to have specialists for each of these functions. So it's okay to have an overhead. It's okay that you are taking 6 weeks to deploy a new strategy because it's hard to squeeze out another percent out of an already optimized page, right? So you have a project manager, whether it's in AEM or in Workfront or in Youre, you name it. Then you need an analyst. It can be Adobe Analytics, but it can be any other analytics solution. Then you have the optimizer that typically uses Adobe Target. The creative that's using, let's say, the Creative Cloud integration, and then lastly, the developer or like the content assembler in AEM. So it's okay to have a team, and it's a team of specialists versus a generalist for the tail. Here's something that I want to point out before we actually get to the solution. One of the big challenges that we see with customers is, and this is just proportional, right? So this is across a set of customers. But if you had, let's say, between 10 and 20 people on the foundation team, and the foundation team is typically those people that keep AEM up and running, they develop templates, they create components, they make sure AEM is up and running, if you will. So those are like people at the foundation team. If you then look at how many people actually use AEM, you'll see that it's only about a quarter. So about 4 to 5 people are what I call the channel practitioner or the experienced author or the content assembler. So the ratio here is much smaller. And then if you compare that to the number of people that use Adobe Target, Adobe Analytics, and let's say a data management platform, you'll see that the ratios are quite interesting. Especially what I want to call out is the fact that on average, you have about 2.5 people that use Adobe Target, 2.5 people that are really experts at defining optimization strategies. And you should take that into account because what typically happens here is when you look at the different business units, right? So where these requests come from, about 25% of these requests that come from the business units are advanced personalization requests. And at the same time, about 75% of these requests are more like very basic. And the idea is that a majority of these requests that come from the BU should be handled by the website team. So those people that know how to use AEM, they're not necessarily very technical. I wouldn't call them developers, but they're knowledgeable enough about AEM to use AEM to actually set up an A/B test. And if you look at the org structure, it's oftentimes built for this scenario. But then what we oftentimes see is if the personalization capabilities in AEM are not properly set up, then you can imagine what's happening. All of those requests get routed through the Adobe Target team. So about 100% of the work, which is obvious, but then the target team is oftentimes not set up to handle that, I would say, amount of work. And oftentimes they then struggle with working on higher value tasks or optimization strategies, and they oftentimes get under pressure where people then say, like, in a sense, you're just a webmaster, if you will. You're just grooming content, and you're not doing what we hired you to do. And the reason is they're just overwhelmed and working on these basic optimization requests that shouldn't be routed through their team in the first place, and they should be routed through AEM. So I would say that's something what we see with a lot of customers. So when I look at some of the examples, so some customers have like way bigger teams, and then the ratio is typically in line. But for those who are in the audience today, is that somewhat in line with what you see at your companies? Does anyone want to share like maybe like a ratio or like some numbers that they have at their company? Anyone? Okay. The next piece is just to quickly summarize before we get into a little bit more technical aspects of the setup between AEM and Target. So for tail, what we covered in the beginning of today is really leverage the integration with Target in AEM for tail pages. If that's not really, let's say, possible, or you're not set up right now, at least make sure that your content editor, whether it's Google Docs or Microsoft Word, implement some sort of a checklist or a template that your content authors can follow. And then lastly but not least, for those few that actually use content marketing platforms, make sure that any kind of personalization that takes place in those content marketing platforms can be carried over into AEM. And then for the head pages, what we just talked about, for basic personalization, again, leverage personalization capabilities in AEM. And for advanced personalization, make sure that you leverage what we've done recently, the ability to expose experience fragments in Adobe Target. So the ability to expose experience fragments into Adobe Target allows users in Adobe Target to do their work much quicker. Their main issue is that they can't repurpose or reuse or find content that already exists. And as a result, what we've done is to expose content from AEM into Adobe Target via experience fragments so that users in Adobe Target can easily implement tests by leveraging content that already exists in AEM. Has anyone heard about the fact that we exposed experience fragments in Adobe Target? Is that well known? Apparently not yet, but let me just spend like a second on the idea of experience fragments. So when you see a page in AEM, right, people would like to be able to reuse an image that they see or some sort of carousel that they see on an existing page. And especially optimizers, people that use Adobe Target, would love to be able to reuse some of the content because oftentimes they're not staffed to actually recreate that content, or more so, oftentimes they don't have the time to create something from scratch, right? So what if they could just repurpose that content that they see on existing pages? And the way we did that in AEM is that we are able to define so-called experience fragments that are based on existing pages, and it allows you to expose experience fragments in Adobe Target. It allows you to do that in Adobe Campaign. It also allows you to do that in any other non-Adobe based solution. So it allows you to expose content across your marketing stack and allows you to reuse that content in many different places. It allows for brand consistency, but more so to increase the amount of content that's being reused across your marketing campaigns. So let's look at what that actually looks like. So I brought an example of how to leverage experience fragments in Adobe Target. But before I do so, I want to share with you, I would say, a pitfall, or I would say a challenge that a lot of customers have when they implement Adobe Target in AEM. And it's much more so about the component approach that is, I think, misunderstood or not used to the optimal degree. So when you look at the component approach in AEM, it is something that a lot of customers struggle. And this is a quote from a friend of mine who said that he doesn't really believe that a system such as AEM or any other web content management system that allows you to create content in a templatized fashion does not allow you to do that at scale, right? It's way too hard to maintain it. You need to hire way too many people to actually work on that. And it kind of is based on the fact that we all know that, because on a Monday you're supposed to implement one landing page, and then by the next review, which takes place a week later, you're supposed to implement a completely different set of pages. So the fact that you can leverage templates in AEM is oftentimes not used the way it should be used. And I think the reason is pretty much here. So when we look at the original approach is oftentimes that a design team kind of agrees on what the look and feel of a landing page looks like, and a set of executives would kind of sign off on that landing page. And then pretty much everyone assumes that this is going to be the structure moving forward for this particular landing page. And then each single component that you have here is basically then set in stone and doesn't account for future change. So people don't necessarily expect that a month later or 2 months later, the marketing team or the executives would come back and say, can we please rearrange this page, right? And that's, like, I would say, the status quo, that you have to expect that changes are being asked for on a constant basis. So how do you actually set up yourself for this constant change? And the change is pretty much based on, and I would love for you to actually write that down or like Google that after today's presentation, is to really think about how to leverage components in AEM in a way so that you can reuse it much easier, right? So as opposed to building components and as opposed to thinking about pages as the ultimate canvas, think about actually about each component as a canvas. What I'm actually saying is that you should increase the number of components, which sounds a little odd at first, but you'll see what that means in the long run in terms of flexibility in your ability to make changes to landing pages the way we just saw that. So when we actually look at a page like this here, you typically have a hero banner, like a background image, right? And then you have a rich text editor that you put on top of that. You basically have like 2 components. In reality, we end up having, let's say, up to 10 of these text boxes. So I'm being fair to the old approach. So you have like basically 2 components. And then you typically leverage Adobe Target to then show one of these 2 components depending on what audience the visitor belongs to or not, right? So that's the standard approach, which works fine as long as there are no changes asked to this page. So if an executive came in and said to completely change the structure of the text, you would have a hard time with that, because basically the rich text editor component is a component that was custom developed, and it took a while to actually do that, and to change it would be quite hard. What would be the new approach? The new approach would be to actually leverage a lot of more components, not necessarily UI components, but a component such as the audience component, right? Audience component just allows you to indicate which audience should be able to see this entire component to begin with, right? So there's no UI work involved. The next piece is to then actually have a carousel component that indicates which components and UI components should be part of the entire page. Then you can have an offer list component, which basically is a data layer that pulls in any kind of information from your catalog as in terms of pricing, in terms of availability, and other information from your piece. Then you would have your first UI component, such as like a background image. And then you would break down each of these text and button components into separate components. And while initially you actually have more components, what actually then happens if you have to change it, let's say if you were to change it to this structure, you would be able to completely reuse the structure, or like the set of components that you introduced in the first place. Why? Because you basically account for the fact that you will be asked to completely change the structure. And the advantage here is there's no need to involve design anymore. There's no need to actually get anyone technically involved. It just takes someone who knows how to use AM to rearrange those components. And I'll give you a couple of examples from an existing customer that has implemented this approach, how much it actually cut down the time in launching these pages. So as opposed to the old approach that takes on average between 4 and 6 months to implement a page like that, it takes another 4 to 6 months just to implement changes to that existing page. In this case, it is quite staggering that it takes a couple of days just to hit the QA stage, right? It's just a matter of rearranging components and accounts for this constant need to change, and it goes back to personalizing, right? So if you want to optimize and really A/B test through experiences, you really want to make sure that your underlying CMS is flexible enough to account for these requests that come in, and it really requires us to leverage components in AM the way they allow you to actually account for this flexibility. Another example, just to show you what typically happens, is let's say if the original design was something like the one on the left-hand side, where you have a bunch of text, then and then the first iteration might be that they just rearrange in the look and feel of this, but they may as well just add some behavioral change where they say it should be based on a drop-down. So if we were to employ and use the old approach, all of this would be custom work that requires, like I said, between 3 and 6 months to implement it each single time a new way. If you actually leverage this new component approach, you just rearrange it and are able to enable your team to do that themselves, right? And then lastly, what if they were to say that it should be part of another big page that comes back to the experience fragments that I mentioned earlier, reusing a component in a different, on a different page allows you to do that in many different ways and opens up your ability to personalize in a much more agile fashion, right? So as opposed to like the static approach where you maybe release 1 or 2 pages per year, you come down to actually having a lot of these pages. Key themes here that we talked about is when you want to set up yourself for success, and if you want to set yourself up to account for this content change, I think the key piece here is to introduce layers that are not based on a page, but are based on user behavior. So really introduce layers that allow you to like rearrange and recompile and reassemble the experience any way you want to. And eventually, if you then actually count how many components you have in your system, you'd be surprised that it's actually fewer components. Why is it fewer components? Because as opposed to creating a different version for every single component in the old approach, you just have like reusable components that allow you to create an unlimited number of experiences. So eventually, the number of components are decreasing and are somewhat stable. There's this initial increase if you were to compare it one-to-one, compared to one page to the other. But long-term, you'll end up having a fewer set of components that will need to operate your pages.
There's one caveat I'd like to add about this. Just from a translation standpoint, this does make translation very difficult because each element, if it's referring to a noun that might have a different sex in another language, then we actually have to have each of the possible combinations as separate elements that can be translated as a whole. If each of these fragments is translated separately or individually, then when you try to assemble it, it might not make sense because it's referring to a masculine noun or a plural or singular. So just be careful, because if you're dealing with international markets, while this makes sense, you're still going to have to make a complete component so that the full context is available, both for an accurate translation and also so that the sexes and everything line up properly.
Right. That's a really great call out. The piece that we're working on Adobe.com, especially around multi-site management, is to really allow you to then tie these together so that we kind of account for this issue. But I think given that these are like head pages, it's more about when we go back to those pages, these are like constantly changes, like almost like on a daily or weekly basis. So it's a really great call out. Yeah. Quick example of like how that actually reduces the time to launch. So let's say for one customer, when they introduced this concept late last year, it took about like 3 to 6 months just to like change the setup. And then when you look at the KPIs and the numbers that have changed, it's just quite phenomenal. So I think the number of hours that it took to maintain and to apply changes to these landing pages went down tremendously. And more importantly, the ability to act on these requests, right? So on a weekly basis, you can almost act on these.
So it seems like this is for the head pages where they're like one-off pages, but it wouldn't make sense to apply this to like an article page where there's 1,000 of them, right?
Exactly.
Then you have to do the same thing every time.
Exactly. That's exactly the piece, and that's why I said like in the beginning, it's like really critical to understand like what type of page this is, and it doesn't make sense to apply the same approach to all pages, and to really ask yourself first, what kind of page am I working on, right? So to really be careful about these pieces, right?
So could you go back 2 slides for one more?
Yep.
Hang on.
I'll send you the I'll send you the. That said, I want to quickly, given that experience fragments are not that well known, I want to quickly explain that here to the audience. So this is an existing page in AEM, right? And if you wanted to make it possible to reuse, or if you wanted to reuse this box or like this section of the page in a different application outside of AEM or in a mobile app or in an email campaign that is not a big campaign, it would be nice if you could designate and encapsulate that piece of content and make that available outside of AEM. And that is possible through experience fragments. Experience fragments is basically the ability to share content across different channels, Facebook, interest. We did the same for WeChat in China. So China is a phenomenal market, and surprisingly to me, which I didn't know that much, there's like this application called WeChat that everyone is using, and the ability to actually reuse content in WeChat, for instance, is based on experience fragments. At the same time, you can then, going back to what we just talked about, the translation aspect, you can actually have multiple variations of that same content, but it's always tying back to the same blueprint, if you will, or like to the master piece. And any kind of translation applied to the master automatically propagates to all the variations. So just like a new way to handle content in AM in a, I would say, page agnostic way. Page agnostic means to me that, let's say back in the day, 5 to 10 years ago, anytime you added content to AM, it had to be a page that you added it to, right? So you couldn't really, not an easy way, add content or like manage content in AM without knowing or without saying what page it should belong to. And we've solved that for in many different ways already a couple of years ago, but I think as we're promoting and as we're talking about these capabilities, it's really critical to understand how that actually enables you to be much more flexible here. Well, let's skip this piece here. And then we'll go to the recap. So I think that the main key pieces that I want to keep you, oops. So the key piece here that I want to really want you to think about is oftentimes the org structure of your team. We've implemented changes to the org structure for a number of customers by now after kind of surfacing the challenge of not necessarily having enough people on the right team to do the right work, right? So oftentimes, if we can't solve for AEM in the short term, at least account the fact that you need more people on the Adobe Target side to help out with some of these pieces. The ability to expose experience fragments in Adobe Target already helps with that because you can enable a lot of people that are trained on a retarget to actually help out with a lot of these changes. But midterm, long term, you should try to fix basically this challenge, which is that AEM does not allow you to work on the basic personalization requests. And then this table that I showed earlier is just as a small guide as to when to use AEM and when to use a retarget for the various types of personalization use cases. And if you remember one thing from today's session, there's like a difference. Not every page is the same, right? And depending based on the fact that not every page is the same, you should really be careful in terms of what approach you choose. And that's what I wanted to present to you today. We've had, like I said, a couple of customers that have had some tremendous results over the last 18 months by just being a little bit more cognizant and a little bit more careful about what they're doing. And if any one of you have any questions, let me know. I'll make this deck available after the conference so that you have access to that. And if you have any questions, reach out to me over LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm always more than excited to engage with customers.